In 1994, a gang in Detroit began breaking into homes while wearing police uniforms and body armor. Their usual targets were the homes of drug dealers and rival gangs, when they stormed the house dressed as police. The criminals inside believed they were facing real officers and didn't resist. As time went on, the gang's operations became more violent, catching the attention of the FBI. The FBI stepped in, determined to uncover who was behind these home invasions. What they found was far more shocking than anticipated. Initially, they didn't know if this gang was a group of criminals impersonating police officers or if they were corrupt or former law enforcement. This is a true crime story filled with thrilling events, intense chases, and a cat and mouse game between the FBI and the gang members. Our story takes place in the 1990s, specifically in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit was known for neighborhoods infested with dangerous gangs where drug trafficking, violence, and all kinds of crimes like theft, murder, and assault were common. Despite efforts by police and local authorities to combat these crimes, it was impossible to fully eradicate them due to the sheer number of gangs in the area. Authorities could only try to maintain some control and prevent things from escalating further. However, things began to spiral out of control when a gang started breaking into homes, seemingly at random. At least that's what the police initially believed. Over time, they noticed a pattern. Reports described a gang breaking into homes wearing police uniforms and body armor. One of these incidents took place in February 1994, when the gang targeted a house in a neighborhood notorious for drug trafficking. Residents were accustomed to police raids, as law enforcement often cracked down on drug dealers. The gang members wore uniforms that resembled police attire, with police written on their body armor, and were armed with heavy weapons resembling a SWAT team. The only noticeable difference was that they weren't wearing helmets, just regular masks. They stormed the house, shouting that they were the police and ordering everyone inside to get on the ground. Naturally, the criminals or drug dealers inside, even if armed, didn't resist. No one wanted a shootout with what they thought was law enforcement. But the situation took a darker turn when the gang members started behaving aggressively, threatening at gunpoint and demanding to know where the money was hidden. One man at first refused to cooperate, believing they were real police officers. But when a shot was fired next to his head, he gave in, revealing that the money was hidden in the couch cushions. The gang quickly took the cash and left. When the man realized they weren't real police officers, he called the actual police to report the break-in. When real officers arrived, they took down his description of the gang. They knew the man was a drug dealer, but they also knew there hadn't been any planned raids on their house, making the man's report highly unusual. This break-in was one of many. Reports came in from all over Detroit, describing a gang dressed in police gear, breaking into homes and stealing cash, valuables, and sometimes drugs. Although many targets were drug dealers, the gang sometimes broke into the homes of innocent people, including the elderly and women, treating them with the same level of brutality. The police documented over 50 similar break-ins within just a few months, all fitting the same profile. Realizing the severity of the situation, they formed a special task force made up of detectives from the Detroit Police Department and FBI agents. As the investigators reviewed the cases, they noticed the gang's methods were strikingly similar to actual police and special forces units. The gang mimicked law enforcement tactics, from breaching doors to controlling the scene. Witness statements suggested the gang had around 8 members, as break-ins were typically carried out by groups of 4 to 8 men. However, many victims were drug dealers and criminals themselves, hesitant to cooperate with the police. To gain cooperation, investigators assured these drug dealers that they weren't interested in arresting them, but were solely focused on stopping the gang, which had brutally attacked innocent people as well. Some of the dealers eventually agreed to share information. Despite this, the gang was incredibly cautious, leaving no evidence behind. The home invasions continued, with increasing violence. In one incident, the gang accidentally raided an elderly woman's house. Mistakenly believing she was hiding money and drugs, they broke her arm during the interrogation. In another raid, they assaulted a mother and daughter. The task force began to suspect that the gang might consist of former police officers, given their knowledge of police tactics. However, after investigating, they found no evidence linking the gang to any current or former officers. Then, on July 26, 1994, a major break came when police responded to a shootout. They found a man badly wounded and dressed in police gear. After being taken to the hospital, he was identified as Dante Garrison. Realizing he could be a gang member, detectives went to question him. Despite his injuries, Dante agreed to cooperate if promised immunity. Eventually, Dante confessed, revealing the gang's structure. The gang had around 30 members, not the 8 initially thought. It was led by 2 men, Obi Carter, the strategist, and Andre Woods, the muscle. Obi handled planning and selecting targets, while Andre led the violent raids, often using brutal force against uncooperative victims. With this information, the task force began monitoring gang locations and wiretapping their phones. Then, on September 4th, 1994, they received a report of a shooting at Andre Wood's house where 4 men were found dead. Witnesses said that Andre shot them during an argument and then disappeared. Just a week later, Andre Wood surprisingly walked into the Detroit police station and surrendered, likely realizing that a nationwide manhunt had made his life on the run impossible. He chose to face his charges in court. The task force was relieved they had finally taken one of the most dangerous men in Detroit off the streets. With Ander behind bars, the focus now shifted to Obi Carter, the mastermind and planner of the gang's operations. The task force knew they had to be extra careful with Obi. He was smart and fully aware that the police were closing in on him, especially after Andrew's arrest. The task force assigned undercover officers to watch him closely and monitored his every move. However, tracking Obi wasn't easy. He was cautious, always one step ahead, and took great care to avoid detection. Despite this, the surveillance teams managed to keep an eye on him. At the same time, the wiretaps on the gang's members were proving useful. Investigators overheard gang members discussing their past robberies, boasting about what they had stolen, and even sharing specific details about the break-ins. The detectives were able to match these conversations with ongoing investigations and reports from victims. This gave them more evidence, but it still wasn't enough. The detectives needed to catch them in the act. Their goal was to arrest the gang members during one of their home invasions, catching them red-handed, so the task force continued their surveillance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One night, while monitoring one of the gang's safe houses, an officer noticed something unusual. A car approached the house, and 4 men got out. At first glance, the vehicle looked like any other, but in reality, it was an undercover police car. The 4 men who exited the vehicle were plainclothes officers armed with pistols. The officer on surveillance was puzzled and quickly radioed back to headquarters for clarification. The response came back swiftly. The 4 men were undercover officers searching for a fugitive in the neighboring houses. They had no idea they were walking right into the territory of one of Detroit's most dangerous gangs. The situation was tense. If the undercover officers got too close to the gang's safe house, it could trigger a violent confrontation. Inside, the gang members had noticed the undercover cops and were already preparing for a shootout. They had armed themselves, fully aware they were dealing with law enforcement despite the plainclothes. You might wonder, how did they know these men were cops even though they were undercover? The answer lies in the fact that even unmarked police cars have certain signs and features that experienced criminals, like this gang, could easily recognize. The gang members knew how to spot these clues. At that moment, the officer watching the scene was terrified the gang might kill the 4 undercover officers. He even considered leaving his car to warn them, but doing so would blow the surveillance operation and ruin months of painstaking work. Luckily, the 4 officers didn't approach the gang's safe house, and the disaster was avoided without the surveillance officer having to expose himself. But just imagine the gang was fully prepared to kill those police officers without hesitation. Through their wiretaps, the task force had overheard gang members talking about the undercover officers. They knew the police were there and were prepared to engage in a shootout if they came too close to the house. This revelation sent a chill down the investigators' spines. It proved the gang was even more dangerous than initially thought. If they were willing to kill law enforcement, it meant they would do anything to avoid capture. This forced the detectives to consider a grim reality. When they moved in to arrest the gang, they would likely face armed resistance. The gang wouldn't surrender without a fight, especially since the investigators wanted to catch them in the act during one of their home invasions. That meant the gang would be armed, wearing body armor and ready to engage in a shootout. So the detectives also had to be cautious about one crucial detail: they couldn't storm the house while the gang was inside, as that could lead to a hostage situation. Innocent people could easily be caught in the crossfire. The best plan was to ambush the gang as they were leaving the house right after they had finished their operation. By then, the gang would be vulnerable, thinking they had successfully completed their crime. The problem, however, was that the gang members were heavily armed, carrying high-powered weapons and armor-piercing bullets. The task force realized they couldn't do this alone. They would need the help of the SWAT team. So the FBI investigators met with the SWAT commander and his second-in-command, explaining their plan to take down the gang. The plan was simple but dangerous. About 20 SWAT officers would hide inside an ambulance to avoid suspicion. They would wait for the gang to finish their home invasion and leave the targeted house. The gang typically used a large van to carry out their heists, and all the members involved in the operation would ride in it. The SWAT team's strategy was to follow the van once it left the scene. The ambulance, with its sirens blaring and emergency lights flashing, would approach the van from behind. The gang, trying to keep a low profile, would likely pull over to let the ambulance pass, but instead of passing, the ambulance would cut them off and block their escape. The 20 SWAT officers concealed inside would quickly jump out and surround the gang's van from all sides, preventing them from opening fire or making any attempt to flee. This was the core of the plan, to catch the gang off guard and ensure there was no chance for a violent confrontation. See,